They called her Ghost. The nickname had started as a joke among the nursing staff at Mercy General, but it stuck because it was true. Elena Martinez moved through the emergency department like smoke, present in one moment, invisible in the next. Her scrubs were always pressed. Her hands never trembled during procedures. She appeared at the medication dispensary exactly when needed, vanished when she wasn't. The ER regulars barely registered her presence anymore. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended. Antiseptic mixed with burnt coffee from the nurse's station, and underneath it all, the metallic smell of old blood that never quite left the trauma bays no matter how many times they scrubbed. Elena moved past the waiting area where a woman held a screaming toddler, past the triage desk where a man with a gashed forehead sat bleeding onto his collar, and straight into Bay 3 where her assigned patient lay post-op. She'd been here for 3 years. Nobody knew her first name. "Ghost, grab me a 14 gauge, Dr. Caldwell called from across the department, his voice carrying the particular arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. He was tall, expensively dressed even in his white coat, with the kind of jawline that had probably opened doors his entire life. His name was Richard Caldwell, and he'd ruled the emergency department at Mercy General like a medieval lord ruling a fiefdom, dispensing favors to those who pleased him, crushing those who questioned his authority. "Yes, Doctor," Elena said, her voice soft, nearly inaudible. She moved toward the supply cabinet with measured steps, her shoulders slightly curved inward, making herself smaller. Making herself forgettable. She pulled the needle from the cabinet and walked it to him, holding it at arm's length like an offering. He took it without thanking her, without even looking at her face. She was already turning away when she heard him mutter to the resident beside him, "Ghost suits her. Invisible. Forgettable. The kind of nurse who does what she's told and doesn't ask questions." The resident laughed. High-pitched, nervous. Elena's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second, a muscle contraction so brief it would have been invisible to anyone watching. Then it released. She had been called many things in her previous life. Colonel. Reaper 6. The Ghost of Mosul. Those names meant something. They carried weight, history, blood. This version of Ghost meant nothing. It was a tool, like her anonymity, like the invisible armor she'd constructed from silence and compliance. What they didn't know was that invisible meant safe. In her locker on the 3rd floor, inside a duffel bag stuffed beneath her civilian clothes, sat a field journal with a leather cover worn soft from desert sand. Inside its pages were pressed flowers from Mosul, flowers she'd picked herself during the 14 days she'd spent searching through rubble after the ambush. Her call sign was written inside the front cover in fading black ink, Reaper 6. Beneath it, in different handwriting, someone had sketched a silhouette of a woman carrying another figure across her shoulders. 2 names were written below the drawing. One was hers. The other was the name of a man she hadn't thought about in 7 years. Until 3 days ago. Elena moved to the next bay, checking vitals on a patient admitted with chest pain. The heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm, a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. She'd heard that beep thousands of times. In San Diego. In Germany. In forward operating bases where the equipment was held together with duct tape and prayers. Her fingers moved across the patient's arm with practiced efficiency, finding the radial pulse, counting beats per minute, her movements precise as a surgical laser. A nurse named Jessica passed by with a stack of charts, her scrubs decorated with cartoon characters, something Elena had never understood. Jessica glanced at Elena without really seeing her, the way people looked at furniture. "Did you hear about the new attending starting next week?" "I heard his from Johns Hopkins." "That's nice," Elena said. "You should try talking to him," Jessica continued, in that particular tone women used when they were trying to be helpful. "Maybe he'd actually notice you." Elena didn't respond. Noticing was the opposite of what she needed. The ER was crowded, the way it always was on Saturday afternoons. 12 beds. 7 of them occupied. An ambulance wailed in the distance, getting closer. The ambulance bay doors were already opening when she heard the radio crackle as Mercy General, this is County Medic 7, ETA for minutes with a 47-year-old male, blunt force trauma to the abdomen, multiple lacerations, vitals unstable. Standing by for bed assignment. Dr. Caldwell was across the department, leaning against the counter, reviewing a chart. He didn't move. Elena watched him for a moment, that particular kind of stillness that meant he was thinking, calculating, deciding who was worthy of his attention. The attending physician was supposed to be in the department. She'd seen him arrive at 1 p.m. 2 minutes passed. The intercom crackled again. The ambulance was 2 minutes out. Elena approached the medication dispensary where Dr. Caldwell stood, her footsteps silent on the tile floor. She waited. He was still reading the chart. Doctor, the inbound trauma needs bed assignment. Dr. Caldwell looked up slowly, as if she'd interrupted something profound. I'm aware, Ghost. I'll assign it when the paramedics arrive. We don't prepare beds for patients who might not survive transport. The vitals suggest possible internal bleeding. If they arrest during transport, we'll need resuscitation set up. The words came out before she could stop them. Soft. Respectful. But they were words that questioned. Words that suggested an alternative to his decision. Dr. Caldwell's expression changed. His eyes narrowed. He set down his chart carefully, as if placing a chess piece on a board he'd been studying for hours. Are you telling me how to run my department, Ghost? No, Doctor. I apologize. Because the last nurse who thought she knew better than me isn't working here anymore. Elena's eyes remained forward. Steady. I understand. The ambulance sirens cut through the building, loud and urgent. The automatic doors hissed open. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher, a patient covered in blood and trauma tape, a paramedic straddling his chest doing compressions. Code blue. Dr. Caldwell moved then, finally, issuing orders with the kind of authority that made everyone move faster. Bay 1. Get 2 large ball lines, push 1 milligram epi, set up for emergency intubation. Someone get me a surgical kit. Elena was already moving. She'd heard that tone before. That particular quality of urgency that meant this was life or death, right now, no time for hierarchy. Her hand steadied the stretcher. Her fingers were already reaching for the 4 setup before the patient hit the bed. The paramedic was still doing compressions, counting cadence, 1, 2, 3, 4. Cardiac monitor, Dr. Caldwell barked. I need a strip. The monitor was already being placed. Elena was running the line into the patient's arm, finding the vein by feel and muscle memory that came from somewhere so deep inside her that it seemed to bypass her brain entirely. The needle went in smooth. Blood flashed in the chamber. Good. The line was in. What happened? Dr. Caldwell demanded from the paramedic. Training accident. Marine commander took a fall from about 20 feet, landed on his ribs. Chest was sucking air when we arrived. We sealed it with tape but something went wrong during transport. Lost pulse 2 minutes ago. A Marine commander. Elena's hands moved on their own, prepping the second line, her movements economical, efficient. Around the bed, the team was assembling, a resident, 2 techs, a respiratory therapist. Everything was chaos and precision at the same time. The monitor showed asystole. Flat line. No rhythm. Continue compressions, Dr. Caldwell said. Push another epi, another round, let's see if we can get anything back. Elena's eyes caught on the patient's face for just a fraction of a second. Tan skin. Dark hair. A scar above his left eyebrow that she recognized. The kind of scar that came from a specific kind of blast fragmentation. No. Not possible. She turned away. Grabbed the medication cart. Handed off the epinephrine to the resident without looking back, without letting her hands shake, without allowing the recognition that had just tried to claw its way up her throat to escape. The body in that bed was a ghost from her old life. Someone she'd carried 2 miles through Mosul while bullets snapped overhead and IEDs crumbled buildings into dust. Someone she'd left bleeding in a field hospital because she'd been medically discharged exactly 18 minutes after his surgery, her own injuries too severe to treat in theater. 7 years. 7 years of silence. 7 years of becoming someone invisible. 7 years of pressing flowers from Mosul into a journal she never opened. And then he arrived, broken and bleeding, in her emergency department. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell was still giving orders, still in charge, still controlling who lived and who died in this room. And if she moved, if she stepped out of her ghost costume for even one moment, if she let 17 years of military training show through the cracks of her civilian disguise, everything would change. Dr. Caldwell gathered the nursing staff at the Central station during shift change, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of monitors and conversations like a scalpel through silk. The fluorescent lights cast everything in clinical white as he leaned against the desk, his tailored coat draped over one arm, the picture of casual dominance. "I'm making a public prediction," he announced, loud enough for the entire department to hear. "Ghost here won't last a week. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, residents, nurses, orderlies, all feeding off his confidence like it was contagious. Elena stood 3 stations down, sorting patient charts with mechanical precision, her breathing steady and measured. 1 breath in. 1 breath out. The same rhythm she'd used in Mosul when mortars landed 200 meters from the medical tent. "Nothing to say, ghost?" "That's what I thought." Caldwell's smile was a predator's smile, all teeth, no warmth. He turned back to his audience, already moving on to the next cruel observation, secure in the knowledge that she wouldn't fight back. That she couldn't. That the quiet ones never did. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, Elena moved through the hospital corridors like a ghost inhabiting her own body. She'd taken the morning shift deliberately, choosing the early hours when Caldwell didn't arrive until 10 a.m., hoping for a buffer of normalcy before the day's real battle began. By afternoon, she needed food. Her blood sugar had dropped enough that her hands had begun to shake slightly during a dressing change, the first sign of her body betraying the discipline she maintained. She walked through the cafeteria line mechanically, Salisbury steak that tasted like formaldehyde, green beans soft from overboiling, a cup of black coffee that at least held some dignity. She carried her tray through the crowded dining area, past 3 nursing students comparing shift notes, past an elderly patient volunteer wiping tables, toward an empty seat near the windows where she might have 5 minutes of relative peace. Caldwell sat 3 tables over, watching her with the focused intensity of a hawk tracking a field mouse. He rose smoothly from his chair, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that signals intent. Elena didn't notice until his hand shot out, his palm connecting with her tray and knocking it from her grip with casual, practiced violence. The tray tumbled through the air in slow motion, or so it seemed, and crashed to the tile floor with a sound like shattering glass. Food scattered everywhere. Salisbury steak slid across the white floor tiles, leaving a trail of brown sauce. Green beans bounced and rolled like tiny verdant marbles. The coffee cup shattered, ceramic shards spinning, the smell of burnt coffee rising like steam. The room went dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused mid-air. 100 eyes turned toward them. "Clumsy," Caldwell said, loud enough for the cafeteria to hear, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You should be more careful, ghost. Hospital policy requires you to clean up any mess you make." He brushed imaginary crumbs from his coat sleeve, his movements precise and unhurried, savoring the moment with the intensity of someone who had orchestrated it perfectly. "I'm sure someone can find you a mop." Elena took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came before orders. Before decisions. Before the moment when everything changed. A single tear escaped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the sheer effort of holding everything back, of keeping the kernel locked inside the nurse's body. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgical laser. "I'll clean it up, Dr. Caldwell," she said quietly, each word precisely articulated. "Then I'll get back to the patients." Her voice was different. Flatter. More dangerous. She crouched without complaint, gathering the scattered remnants of her lunch, the broken ceramic, the food, the dignity she was still choosing to maintain through sheer force of will. The other staff members looked away, embarrassed for her or ashamed of their own paralysis. She couldn't tell which. She didn't care which. That evening, just before shift change at 19:10 hours, Caldwell caught her at the nursing station. He gathered 3 residents and 2 attending physicians around him like an audience, making sure she had witnesses. He picked up her patient charts, 7 of them, carefully organized, each one annotated with notes about vital signs, medication reconciliation, care plans for the next shift. He held them in his hand for 3 seconds, letting everyone see what was coming. Then he threw them at her feet, paper scattering like autumn leaves in an October wind, spreading across the floor in a chaotic fan pattern that would take 10 minutes to reassemble in proper order. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice coated in faux gentleness that made the cruelty underneath even more visible. "Can't have the floor looking unprofessional." Elena crouched without a word, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She gathered the papers one by one, straightening them, checking each one to ensure the pages were still in order. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. There was nothing but composure in her posture, and the composure itself became an insult to Caldwell, the implication that he wasn't important enough to break her, that his cruelty was background noise, ambient hostility she'd learned to move through like water. When she stood, holding the reorganized charts against her chest, her voice came out like a command issued to troops preparing for combat. "When you're finished performing, Dr. Caldwell, I'll be saving the patients you're too busy to see." The words were quiet enough that only the people immediately surrounding them could hear, but they carried the weight of certainty. Not a request. Not a plea. A statement of fact from someone who'd made it true 1,000 times before. His face flushed red, not from anger alone, but from rage born of losing control. She'd violated the unspoken rule of humiliation. The victim wasn't supposed to respond. The victim was supposed to break quietly, in private, away from witnesses. Elena had turned his public performance into a moment of his weakness instead. She watched his jaw tighten, watched the vein in his temple darken, and then she simply turned and walked away, moving toward Trauma Bay 2 where a patient with a post-surgical infection needed her attention. Her scrubs had a small stain of Salisbury steak sauce on the sleeve. Her badge hung at the same angle it always did. She looked exactly like a tired nurse heading back to work. But something fundamental had shifted. The walls of her invisibility, the careful construction of a civilian life built on anonymity and restraint, had begun to crack. Not from the moment he knocked her tray. Not from the charts scattered on the floor. But from the moment she'd chosen to speak back, not with anger, but with the cold certainty of someone who'd led infantry soldiers through hostile territory, who'd held the line when retreat would have been easier, who'd made decisions that cost lives and saved lives with the same steady voice. The colonel had shone through for just a moment, and she couldn't push her back down completely anymore. She didn't know that Caldwell had already begun making calls. That he was already building a case against her, piece by piece, with the strategic precision of someone who understood institutional power the way she understood combat medicine. She didn't know that within 5 hours, everything would accelerate. That the moment she'd been dreading for 17 years, the moment when her past collided with her present, was already in motion, set in place by the simple fact that a Marine commander from Mosul had scheduled himself into trauma protocol at Mercy General Hospital in San Diego. The call came through the radio at 18:47 hours, incoming trauma from Camp Pendleton, Marine commander, training accident, ETA for minutes. Elena's head lifted from the charting she was doing at Station 4. The other nurses barely reacted. Incoming traumas were routine, part of the rhythm of emergency medicine. But something in her nervous system recognized the voice of the paramedic relaying the information. Something older than conscious thought, something trained into her across 18 months of combat deployment, registered the particular cadence and gravitas in those 4 words: Marine. Commander. Training. Accident. She moved without deciding to move. Her hands were already gathering the trauma bay supplies, moving with the efficiency of muscle memory, the kind of automatic precision that only came from having done something 10,000 times before. Bay 3 was empty. She prepped it with mechanical efficiency, trauma shears positioned at the head of the bed, 2 liters of normal saline on the pressure infuser, the crash cart within arm's reach, the monitor leads ready to attach. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands didn't shake. This was still in the civilian world. Still contained. Still safe. The ambulance doors burst open at 18:51 hours, 4 minutes early. 2 paramedics rushed the gurney, their movements sharp and urgent. The patient's chest was sucking air through a puncture wound. She could see the wound immediately, a small dark hole just beneath the left clavicle, the kind of wound that meant tension pneumothorax, that meant a lung collapsing, that meant minutes before the patient went into cardiac arrest. His tactical vest was still strapped to his chest, mud caked on the desert camouflage pattern from training exercises in the California Badlands. His field gear lay on the gurney beside him, MRE packets clipped to his webbing, a water bottle, and something that made Elena's entire body freeze for exactly 0.3 seconds, his field journal, the leather worn soft with use, pages folded and creased from 18 months of life in a combat zone. She recognized the journal before she recognized the face. She recognized it the way she would recognize the sound of her own heartbeat. That journal had been in the Tactical Operations Center in Mosul. She'd seen that exact same leather wear pattern on the journals of 3 other unit commanders. She'd get into radiology, we need imaging before. Caldwell's voice cut through the moment like a knife. He was already issuing orders, already establishing hierarchy, already taking control of the trauma in the way that made him feel powerful. Elena's voice came out quiet and precise, the way she'd been trained to communicate in environments where shouting meant losing control. He'll code before we get him down the hall. Not a question. A statement of medical fact. We decompress now. You don't make that call, Ghost, Caldwell snapped, his authority flaring like a threatened animal showing teeth. I'm the senior physician here, and we follow protocol. The commander's oxygen saturation dropped, the monitor showing 92, then 88, then 84 in the space of 12 seconds. His skin was taking on the grayish tint of hypoxia. His breathing became more labored, the wound pulling air into the chest cavity with each breath, the pressure building, crushing the lung. Elena's eyes found the Marine's field gear on the gurney. The MRE packets. The tactical vest. The survival instinct that had kept her alive through 17 years of civilian life screamed at her to stop, to step back, to let this moment pass unnoticed. She didn't listen. Her hands moved with combat medical precision, the kind of precision that came from field medicine in Mosul, from triage in 118-degree heat, from making decisions in seconds that meant the difference between lives saved and lives lost. She reached for an MRE packet, tore it open with her trauma shears, and pulled out the silver-lined interior, the chemical heating element and the food pouch, components that most people in the hospital didn't understand but that Elena recognized as the perfect improvised chest seal. She cut the packet, positioned it over the wound, sealed it with medical tape with movements so economical and precise that they looked like choreography. What the hell are you doing? Caldwell's voice rose, fury replacing authority. That's not, you can't just. The commander's vitals climbed. 88, 91. 95, oxygen saturation rising as the improvised seal held, as the lung re-expanded, as the pressure inside his chest normalized. The paramedic, an older man with a 1,000-yard stare and the kind of bearing that suggested he'd seen combat zones, watched her hands with recognition dawning in his eyes like sunrise. He'd seen field medicine. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Elena stepped back, adrenaline draining from her system, realizing with absolute clarity that she'd just done something that couldn't be undone. She'd revealed something that had been carefully hidden. She'd used knowledge and skill that a civilian nurse shouldn't possess. She'd shown her hands, literally and figuratively, in a way that couldn't be explained away or forgotten. The commander's field journal had fallen from his gear, tumbling across the emergency room floor in slow motion, landing at her feet. The pages fell open. Pressed desert flowers, flowers from Mosul, tiny dried petals that had been preserved between pages for 18 months, scattered across the trauma bay floor like breadcrumbs leading directly back to another life. And then the monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Settling into a steady, normal rhythm. The rhythm flat-lined. Not the monitor. Not yet. The commander, his chest wall moving in that awful synchronous pattern with the ventilator, not breathing on his own, not even trying. Elena's hand steadied the endotracheal tube as the suction cleared pink-tinged fluid from his airway. Sinus rhythm. Good. The O2 sat climbing, 78, 82, 87. Better. But Caldwell was already there, already talking. Get him on a dopamine drip. 2 micrograms per kilo. Caldwell circled the resuscitation bay like a predator establishing dominance. And I want a chest X-ray before any other imaging. He's unstable. He has a pneumothorax, Elena said quietly, her eyes never leaving the monitor. Tension physiology. Chest tube placement first. I'm aware of basic trauma protocol, nurse. The word hung in the air like a blade. Get me the supplies. Now. The thing about controlled chaos is that it only works if one person is making the decisions. 2 voices giving orders create a vacuum where people freeze. A resident froze. A tech froze. The attending anesthesiologist, already gowned and ready, looked between them both. Elena could have stepped back. Should have, according to every protocol manual Caldwell had ever written. Instead, she moved. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand before the thought finished forming. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomy lived in her shoulders, in the precise angle her wrist knew without asking her permission. Muscle memory. Combat muscle memory. The kind forged in a field hospital in Mosul when there was no attending, no residents, no safety net. Just choices and consequences and hands that had to work. What are you doing? Caldwell's voice rose. The needle entered. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space, that sound, she'd almost forgotten that sound. Pressure released. The commander's oxygen saturation climbed, 88, 91, 94. His blood pressure ticked up on the monitor, numbers moving in the direction of survival. Securing the airway, Elena said, her voice steady as morphine. He was hypoxic. Caldwell's face darkened. A vein pulsed at his temple. He reached for the commander's chart, scanned the vitals, and did something worse than yelling. He smiled. Good work, he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. Though next time, wait for orders. This is my department. She didn't acknowledge him. The smile was a weapon. She'd seen weapons before. The commander stabilized in the next 90 minutes. Elena placed the chest tube, confirmed placement with ultrasound, 2.8 milliliters of blood and air draining immediately, and watched his color improve. Pink returning to his lips. Warmth returning to his extremities under the bear hugger blanket Caldwell had suddenly approved. By 1947 hours, the commander was sedated, stable, heading to the ICU on his own power instead of crashing into a code she might not survive professionally. That was when the walls began closing in. Elena returned from bathroom break to find her assigned nursing staff dispersed. Jamie, who'd been with her throughout the resuscitation, was now assigned to Trauma Bay 2. Marcus, the tech, had been pulled to triage. She stood at the nursing station, holding nothing, responsible for everything, while Caldwell worked the phones in his glassed office. His voice carried. They all knew it would. Budget constraints, he was saying, his tone regretful, sympathetic. She's overqualified for night shifts anyway. Probably happier in a quieter rotation. The shift supervisor approached Elena with the schedule printed fresh from the system. Apologetic. Young. Scared of Caldwell in the way people get scared of him. Night shift starting tomorrow, the supervisor said quietly. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Just you, one tech, covering the trauma bays. It's temporary. He said budget cuts. Elena looked at the schedule. Night shifts meant no continuity with the commander's recovery. No visibility. No chance to advocate. No witnesses to whatever happened in the dark hours. Understood, Elena said. But the schedule was just the opening move. By hour 3 of the commander's recovery, her access card no longer opened the supply room door. The reader beeped red. Elena stood at the locked door, conscious of people watching. They were always watching when something went wrong, and walked to find Caldwell. He was waiting. That was the only explanation. He was at his desk when she approached, and his expression didn't change, which meant he'd anticipated this moment. Dr. Caldwell, my access. Restricted. He didn't look up from his keyboard. Protocol security. We've had inventory discrepancies in the trauma supplies. Until the audit is complete, access is limited to verified supervisors. I'm assigned to that bay. Then you'll request supplies through me. I'm here until 11. He glanced up, and the smile was there again. After that, I'm sure you'll manage. The message was clear: manage without supplies, or leave. Those were the options he was offering. Elena managed. She gathered what she could from the accessible supply carts. She communicated with the ICU team about what the commander would need during transfer. She worked around Caldwell like a river works around stone, changing shape, finding the path that costs less, moving on. But by hour 4, something changed. She saw him pull her personnel file. Saw him scroll through screens with the laser focus of someone who'd done this before. His fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, opening documents, scanning, printing. 7 pages came out of the printer. He read them, his eyes widening at something, and then his jaw tightened and his expression shifted into something satisfied and dangerous. Highlight pen. Red. He marked sections, circled names, made notes in the margins. Building something. Piece by piece by piece. Elena watched from across the department, aware that she was watching, aware that watching and doing nothing was its own kind of violence. But the commander was stable. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that could matter right now. She had a break at 18:46 hours, a single hour before Caldwell left, and she walked to the ICU. The commander's room was private, monitored, the kind of careful recovery that meant he'd be fine. The machines beeped their mechanical rhythm. The ventilator cycled air in and out of lungs that would learn again how to breathe on their own. His field journal sat on the bedside table. Battered olive canvas, worn soft by years of deployment, held together with duct tape and purpose. Someone, a nurse with compassion or curiosity, had recovered it from his field gear and placed it where he could see it when he woke. Elena opened it. After-action reports, meticulous handwriting documenting every operation. Fallujah coordinates. Sanjin Valley timelines. Casualty counts that made her chest tight. And then the pressed flowers, desert roses, brittle and pale as bone, pressed between pages dated March 2014. From Mosul. From the convoy ambush en route Firdos. And there, in the commander's own handwriting, in the margin of an after-action report from that day, a call sign: Reaper 6 extracted 8 Marines under fire, sustained multiple wounds, refused evacuation until all personnel secured. 8 Marines. She remembered 8. She remembered the dust. She remembered the weight of the smallest one, Sergeant James Patterson, 22 years old, shot through the leg, screaming until she reached him. She remembered 2 miles of burning daylight and her own left side catching something hot and sharp and unforgiving, but not mattering because 8 Marines had to walk out and she could crawl. Her hands began to shake. Not from weakness. From recognition. From the wall she'd built so carefully over 18 years starting to crack, fissures spreading through the foundation of Elena Martinez, civilian nurse, ghost in the hallways of Mercy General, the woman who'd learned how to disappear inside her own life. This man, this commander, he knew who she was. His journal proved it. His survival proved it. And somewhere in the system, in the files Caldwell was highlighting in red, that truth was about to become a weapon. 5 hours after Elena's hands had moved on instinct, muscle memory pulling her through a procedure that shouldn't have worked, Dr. Caldwell sat in his office on the 4th floor with his door locked and his computer screen glowing in the half-dark. The hospital security system had flagged something during the commander's admission, a cross-reference check that required elevated clearance, the kind of background investigation that only surfaced when the Pentagon had an interest in a case. He'd used his connections, called in favors he'd been saving for exactly this moment. The hospital board chairman's assistant owed him a consultation on her daughter's medical school applications. The chief of security had accepted for courtside tickets to the Padres season. Small leverage. Decisive leverage. The file opened on his screen, and Caldwell's pupils dilated. Classified sections blacked out in PDF format, but the header was visible: Colonel Elena Martinez. Discharged. Medical. PTSD designation. Combat deployment timeline: 3 tours, 12 years, Mosul Sector Command. His fingers trembled as he scrolled, not with excitement, but with the cold certainty of a man who'd just confirmed his opponent was far more dangerous than she'd appeared. The mouse moved almost of its own accord, and he pulled the shared drive information, uploading sections to a secure folder. The hospital CEO received an email at 8:13 p.m. with the subject line, "Confidential Personnel Matter, Recommendation for Immediate Termination." By 9:15 p.m., calls had been made. Caldwell had rehearsed them perfectly. To the board chairman, "We have a serious liability issue. A nurse with undisclosed military psychiatric discharge, hidden background, unauthorized procedure on a critical patient. This is negligence waiting to be a lawsuit." To the chief operating officer, "I've documented insubordination, falsification of the employment application. She never disclosed military history, never mentioned prior medical discharge. That's grounds for immediate termination under hospital policy for point 7.3. To his ally in administration, Conference Room B, tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. We need this resolved before the day shift arrives. I'll present the file. The decision will be unanimous." He'd constructed the termination case piece by piece, the way a strategist builds a siege. Medical file highlighted in yellow. Performance reviews annotated with dates and witness statements he'd solicited from nurses who'd witnessed her insubordination during the code. Policy violations outlined in a PowerPoint presentation with 17 slides. Background check summary in a professional folder. By 10:16 p.m., the documentation was airtight. By 11:44 p.m., the decision had been made. The hospital's risk management team wanted her gone by end of shift. Caldwell smiled at his screen, the kind of smile that belonged on the face of someone who'd just checkmated an opponent who didn't even know they were playing. Elena sat in her car in the parking garage on level 3, engine dead, her head resting on the steering wheel. The leather was cool against her forehead. She'd been there for 14 minutes without moving, unable to process the physics of breathing when the weight of exposure crushed down on her chest like a body pressing her into concrete. The termination hearing had been called to recess pending final decision, but there was no recess coming. There was only the certainty that Dr. Caldwell had accessed something he shouldn't have, something that would destroy the fragile piece she'd constructed over 5 years of invisibility. The field journal lay on her passenger seat, its leather cover worn soft from handling, pages dog-eared and water-stained from desert conditions. She'd recognized it the moment the commander arrived in the trauma bay, the same journal she'd seen him writing in at FOB Shank, documented observations about unit readiness and personnel performance. Inside were notes about operations, call signs of the officers and enlisted personnel who'd served under her command. Her call sign, Reaper 6. The pressed flowers from Mosul had fallen from between its pages when she'd pulled it from the EMT's jump bag, desert blossoms she'd shown him one afternoon in 2016, a moment of weakness during a briefing at the TOC, a moment when she'd let her mast slip for long enough to show him the person underneath the uniform. He'd pressed one flower between those pages that same day. She remembered the gesture, the quiet way he'd acknowledged her humanity when everyone else saw only rank and protocol. Now the flowers lay scattered across the leather seat like evidence of a crime she'd never committed, the crime of surviving, of choosing a new identity, of believing she could erase the past by refusing to acknowledge it. The parking garage air smelled like diesel fumes from the medical supply trucks and the metallic tang of rust from the concrete pillars. Fluorescent work lights hummed above her car, casting shadows that made everything look like something from a nightmare. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they belonged, exactly where they didn't belong anywhere anymore. In 5 hours, Dr. Caldwell would assemble the administration in Conference Room B. In 5 hours, he would present the classified file and the documentation of her insubordination and the falsified application. In 5 hours, they would vote to terminate her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he'd found out. Somehow, despite the sealed records and the no-phone classifications and the 3 different layers of compartmentalization that protected her privacy, he'd found out what she was. Who she'd been. What she'd given up. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear, it was the effort of restraint, the physical manifestation of a colonel who'd trained herself never to show weakness, never to break, never to let anyone see the knife edge she walked between 2 identities. She pulled out her phone. No messages. No calls from command. No cavalry. Just the normal silence that had defined the last 5 years of her life, the same silence that had felt like safety until the moment it became the sound of her world collapsing. She thought about calling someone, anyone, a friend from the Marines, a therapist, someone in the chain of command who might still have her back. But there was no chain anymore. There was only the decision she'd made to disappear, to become invisible, to believe that the past could stay buried if she just worked hard enough and kept her head down and never, ever drew attention to herself. Elena lifted her head from the steering wheel and stared at the dashboard, at the reflection of her own face in the darkened windshield. The woman looking back at her was someone she didn't recognize, someone caught between 2 lives, belonging fully to neither, acceptable to the military past only if she disappeared from it, acceptable to the civilian present only if she erased everything that made her who she really was. The journal on the passenger seat seemed to pulse with its own weight, pressing the truth outward. Someone knew. Someone had recognized her. Someone from the old world had walked back into her carefully constructed new one, and there was no going back. In 5 hours, it would all be gone. The job. The apartment with the view of the bay. The Thursday morning runs through Balboa Park. The carefully maintained anonymity that had allowed her to sleep without medication, to work without the nightmares, to exist as someone other than the woman who'd carried a Marine 2 miles through enemy fire with a fractured ankle and shrapnel wounds she never reported. In 5 hours, the hospital would be rid of her. And somewhere in the classified files that Dr. Caldwell had pulled from databases she didn't know he could access, the Pentagon would have to be notified that a colonel with an active security clearance had been terminated for falsifying an employment application, a termination that would trigger internal review boards and investigations that would ripple all the way back to whatever field she'd been listed as on unpaid administrative leave. The silence inside her car was complete. Even the parking garage seemed to hold its breath. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of 5 years of invisible service, 5 years of saving lives without recognition, of being dismissed and underestimated and disrespected, of letting Dr. Caldwell treat her like something disposable because that was safer than revealing what she actually was. 5 years of being a ghost, and now the ghost was about to be exorcised by the very system she'd tried to escape. Elena picked up the field journal and opened it carefully, letting the pressed flowers fall into her palm. The petals were papery and fragile, the color faded from 5 years of preservation. They'd been yellow once, she remembered. Small blooms from a desert plant with a name she'd never learned, shown to her by a Marine commander who'd wanted to remind her that beauty could exist even in the worst places. That humans could still see beauty even when surrounded by devastation. That the worst version of yourself wasn't the only version that existed. She closed her hand around the flowers and felt them crumble to powder against her skin. The journal lay open on the seat, pages filled with neat handwriting and tactical notes, and somewhere in there, she knew it without having to look, her call sign written in the margins of his observations. Proof. Evidence. Everything she'd tried to erase, preserved in leather and pressed flowers, and the memory of a man who'd never stopped seeing her as anything other than the officer who'd saved his life. The sound of a helicopter, distant but growing steadier, cut through the parking garage silence. Elena's eyes snapped open. The rotors were too far away to be emergency transport for the hospital. They were approaching from the northeast, military trajectory, that particular cadence that only came from the big aircraft used for priority transport. Her phone remained silent. The administration had no idea. Dr. Caldwell had no idea. Nobody knew that somewhere above San Diego, traveling at roughly 170 miles per hour, the past was coming to collect what it was owed. The boots hit the polished tile of Mercy General's main entrance at 2,300 hours, echoing through the lobby like gunshots on concrete. Two Marines in dress blues, uniforms pressed so sharp they could cut glass, walked with the kind of purposeful stride that made orderlies step aside without being told. Their presence didn't announce itself, it commandeered the air pressure in the room. Security nodded them through without checking credentials. Some authority doesn't need a badge. Upstairs in Conference Room B, Dr. Caldwell was mid-sentence, his voice dripping with predatory satisfaction as he outlined the termination case he'd meticulously constructed. The hospital CEO sat rigid at the head of the table, 3 board members flanking him like supporting pillars. Elena stood alone on the opposite side, her white coat suddenly feeling like armor that couldn't stop bullets. Caldwell's case file lay open before him, printouts of her insubordination, the reassignments he'd orchestrated, documentation of her unauthorized use of medical equipment, all of it forensically designed to make her look reckless, unstable, unfit. He was just beginning to savor the moment when the elevator doors opened 2 floors below. Colonel Martinez is being terminated effective immediately, Caldwell was saying, his smile like a wolf showing its teeth. For violation of hospital protocol, for exceeding her scope of practice, and for falsifying her. The conference room door opened. A Marine in dress blue stepped inside, his expression carved from granite. Behind him came another. And behind him, a general, 3 stars on each shoulder catching the fluorescent light like medals of authority itself. The room didn't just go quiet. It suffocated. All the air seemed to leave at once. Dr. Caldwell's smile froze mid-expression. "This is a private." "It's not," the general said. His voice carried the weight of 40 years of command. "This is a formal military inquiry into personnel actions taken against an active duty service member. You'll remain silent unless asked a direct question." "Understood." Caldwell's jaw clenched. He understood nothing except that the ground had opened beneath him. The door opened again. The Marine commander walked in, no longer in a hospital gown, his dress uniform fitted perfectly despite 3 days of intensive care. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose body was still negotiating with trauma, but his eyes were alert, focused, dangerous in the way that came from surviving things that were designed to kill you. He positioned himself next to Elena, close enough that their sleeves almost touched. And then he said 2 words that reverberated through the conference room like a detonation charge, Reaper 6. The elderly security guard, a Gulf War veteran who'd been posted outside the conference room, heard those words through the open door. His body went rigid. His hand moved to his chest in an instinctive salute even though he was out of uniform, out of service, out of everything except the muscle memory of respect. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of recognition, "Marine Colonel, sirs." Elena's breath caught. No one had called her that in 5 years. No one knew who she'd been before she became Ghost. The general stepped forward, and the entire room understood that what was about to happen would matter. He opened a leather folder. Inside was a citation, words printed in the formal script reserved for extraordinary actions. He read aloud, his voice steady and deliberate, "Silver Star, presented to Colonel Elena Maria Martinez, United States Marine Corps, for gallantry in action on March 17, 2019, Mosul, Iraq." Then Major Martinez maintained tactical command of a 4-person element during a convoy ambush in the Jolan district. When her commanding officer, Marine Commander James Holloway, was wounded during the initial attack, she relocated him 2 miles through sustained enemy fire, navigating 3 separate firefights and 1 IED blast radius, providing emergency medical intervention despite her own injuries, and coordinating extraction for 8 personnel, all of whom survived and returned to operational status. Her actions exemplified the highest standards of Marine Corps values and demonstrated tactical competence under conditions that would have justified retreat. Awarded in recognition of heroic conduct in direct contact with the enemy. The CEO's face drained of color. His hand actually trembled as he set down his pen. The board members exchanged glances, the kind of looks that preceded scrambling distance from a collapsing hierarchy. Dr. Caldwell opened his mouth. Closed it. His face cycled through red to white to something resembling ash. This is... I wasn't aware that... You weren't, the general cut him off. His tone suggested that lack of awareness was the least of Caldwell's problems. You accessed classified military records. You attempted to terminate a service member based on fraudulent performance documentation. You built a case specifically designed to isolate her and make her vulnerable. And you did it while she was saving a Marine commander's life in your emergency department. The general stepped closer to Caldwell, not threatening, just present in a way that made the room understand what real authority looked like. You're fired, effective immediately. Your hospital credentials are revoked. Your medical license is under federal review for violations of personnel law and misuse of classified information. The Department of Defense will be filing charges for attempting to terminate a service member using falsified documentation. Security will escort you from the premises. Your personal effects will be packaged and delivered to your home address. You will not return to this facility. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the certainty of someone who'd given thousands of them. Security appeared in the doorway as if they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Caldwell tried to stand, tried to speak, something about his rights, about patient safety protocols, about this being an overreach, but the general's stare silenced him like a gun being cocked. The security officers flanked him. His cardboard box of personal items was already waiting downstairs. His access badge was already deactivated. His name was already being stripped from the directory board in the lobby by a facilities worker who'd been standing by, waiting for the signal. Elena watched him being escorted out, and she felt something shift inside her chest, not satisfaction, because she'd never learned to enjoy watching anything die, even things that deserved it. Just an understanding that some debts were finally being paid. The commander squeezed her hand. His grip was steady. His eyes met hers with recognition that went deeper than words. The CEO cleared his throat, suddenly desperate to establish that he'd never supported Caldwell, that he'd always had reservations about his aggressive management style, that he was actually quite progressive in his thinking about personnel matters. The general didn't even look at him. He was looking at Elena. You maintained your cover for 5 years, he said quietly. You didn't use your rank. You didn't leverage your clearance. You came here to heal and to disappear. That takes discipline. He paused. We're not here to pull you back. We're here to say that if you ever want to return to active duty, there's a position waiting. No pressure. No expectations. Just an open door. Elena's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. The past 5 years of invisibility, of being ghost, of pouring everything into helping people who would never know what she'd sacrificed, it suddenly felt less like running and more like choosing. The news cameras that Caldwell had summoned for what he'd promised would be a policy enforcement demonstration captured everything. The general in dress uniform. The Marines in dress blues. The recovered commander in formal attire. And Elena, still in her nursing scrubs, suddenly recognizable as something more than a hospital staff member. By the time the evening broadcast went live, the story had already moved nationally. Decorated Marine colonel working as nurse at San Diego Hospital fired by administrator, Pentagon intervenes, former commanding officer credits her with saving his life in Iraq. Caldwell's medical license was suspended within 48 hours pending investigation. 3 board members who'd supported him distanced themselves through their attorneys. The hospital's legal team began reviewing 5 years of his personnel actions for liability. Within 2 weeks, he'd found work mopping floors at the VA hospital in El Centro. Within a month, he was being supervised by the same veterans he'd once dismissed as charity cases, Gulf War vets, 2 Purple Heart recipients, a Marine who'd lost his right arm below the elbow and now wore a prosthetic that had cost more than Caldwell's monthly mortgage. The irony was so sharp and precise it could have been executed in a surgical suite. 6 months later, Elena Martinez walked through Mercy General's main entrance at 0730 hours, white coat embroidered with Chief of Emergency Medicine on the pocket. The staff who'd watched her in silence, who'd seen her accept Caldwell's humiliation without breaking, who'd whispered about Ghost and dismissed her as just another quiet nurse, those same people now sought her mentorship. A trauma surgeon in the hallway said, "Colonel, we have a referral question," and the title sounded natural, earned, like something that had always been true. The protocol she implemented began saving lives within weeks. Combat medical techniques adapted for civilian trauma care. The kind of field triage thinking that came from having actually worked in fields where every second determined who lived and who died. The emergency department's mortality rate dropped 23% in the first quarter under her leadership. The nursing staff she'd once worked alongside began telling stories, how Ghost had stayed for an extra 4 hours once to mentor a new resident, how she'd caught a potential medication error that would have killed a patient, how she'd sat with a dying man for an hour after her shift ended, just so he wouldn't be alone. The commander visited monthly, physical therapy complete, back to active duty as the operations officer for 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He and Elena would sit in her office during her lunch break, and he'd tell her about the new Marines he was training, and she'd talk about the cases that stuck with her. Their friendship had been forged in fire and blood in Mosul, and it had been tempered and refined in the crucible of Mercy General. It was the kind of friendship that needed no explanation and could survive any distance. On her office wall, framed in polished maple, were the pressed desert flowers from the commander's field journal, the same journal that had fallen open when she performed the improvised chest seal 5 years earlier. Next to them hung her Silver Star citation. Not hidden anymore. Not secret. Just hanging there, visible to anyone who walked in, a reminder that some people carried their history with them openly, and it made them stronger, not weaker. A young nurse, barely 23, fresh out of her BSN program, asked Elena one day during a staff meeting how she stayed so calm during chaos. How she moved through trauma without freezing, without panicking, without the kind of emotional flooding that made most people useless in critical moments. Elena thought about the parking garage, about sitting in her car with the engine dead and her head on the steering wheel, about believing that exposure meant the end of everything. She thought about the moment the general walked through that conference room door, and the instant her life had transformed from hiding into becoming. She smiled at the young nurse. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Outside Mercy General's windows, California sun warmed the glass and the parking lot and the street where Elena had once sat in her car believing everything was finished. She wasn't Ghost anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was Elena Martinez, Colonel in the United States Marine Corps, Chief of Emergency Medicine at one of the West Coast's most respected trauma centers, and the woman who'd learned that freedom wasn't something you found somewhere else, it was something you reclaimed by refusing to let anyone else define what you were capable of becoming. The commander texted her that night, "Monthly visit next week. Bringing someone I want you to meet." Elena smiled, texted back a confirmation, and returned to reading the patient charts on her desk. Whatever came next, she was ready. She'd survived worse than this, and she'd keep surviving, keep healing, keep standing in the place where broken things came to be made whole. The pressed flowers in the frame caught the afternoon light, and Elena allowed herself, finally, to breathe. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we expose the truth about heroes working in plain sight. Like this video if you believe hidden strength matters more than visible authority. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been radically underestimated by someone who had no idea who you actually were? What happened when they found out?